The sea was calm at noon when the watch called out that something could be seen floating ahead. The ship slowed down, and it was apparent that the object was an open ship's lifeboat, floating in the mid-Atlantic. The purported words of Irish author Sir Shane Leslie, a passenger on RMS Oceanic, which crossed the Atlantic in May 1912. The lifeboat in question, barely afloat, awash and derelict, revealed a gruesome scene. Within its decaying structure, bodies of sailors and passengers were scattered throughout, amongst the thwarts. For a month, their corpses, bleached by the sun and salt, had been pitched by the Atlantic swell under the open sky. The canvas sidings of the collapsible were not erected, suggesting that the launch had been hurried and desperate. How many of the initial inhabitants had been swept overboard from swells, or simply collapsed from exhaustion or exposure into the frigid waters, was unknown. Those who had perished and remained within, and the jetsam of the boat itself, were amongst the few discoveries directly linked to the loss of the Titanic. Despite numerous searches, scant recovery was made of further wreckage and victims. These were the first sightings of anything related to the ship since it was photographed by Kate Odell as the great liner departed from the coast of Ireland on the 11th of April. Rumours abounded then, as they do now, of what fate befell the world's largest ocean liner on her maiden voyage. A catastrophic storm, a sudden rogue wave, or an impact with ice. Something had caused the ship to disappear and go down with all hands. To add further confusion, no distress signal was sent from her, no major storms reported during her journey, and she was designed in a manner to withstand any potential collision, many dubbing her unsinkable. Then there is the enigma of the SS Californian, a Layton line steamer travelling toward Boston, which supposedly was in the vicinity of Titanic's scheduled route and had witnessed signal rockets in the very early hours of the 15th of April, but testimony from the crew was contradictory. Did they see company rockets from an unknown source, or signs of distress from the Titanic? For over 100 years, the greatest maritime mystery continued to confound and intensify speculation. This eventuality, which would have added further intrigue to the tragedy, was narrowly avoided thanks to the actions of just two men. If you know anything about the Titanic, then none of what I have said so far is accurate to the fate of her sinking. Or to be clear, the previously mentioned accounts are true, but there are caveats. The discovery of a lifeboat did occur. It was Collapsible A which was found adrift, but contained only 3 bodies. These were those who had been left behind when 5th Officer Lowe had transferred the surviving occupants to the lifeboat under his command. The Californian had in all likelihood witnessed the Titanic fire distress rockets, but controversially failed to respond. Above all, we know what took place that night because of the hundreds of witnesses who did survive in the boats and were rescued by the RMS Carpathia. After receiving a distress call from the Titanic as a result of wireless telegraphy, the Carpathia made haste to the scene and successfully accounted for all the lifeboats within hours of arrival. Survivors quickly released statements, sent telegrams, and testified what they had witnessed and experienced to a disbelieving world. Without these depositions, an iceberg collision would no doubt have been a popular theory, due to the proclivity of ice that far south during that month of April, in addition to previous cases of similar maritime incidents. The infamous details, however, hard a starboard, 11:40 p.m, 2 hours and 40 minutes, etc., would be lost to the sea. A situation which a call for assistance failed to hail any nearby ship was thankfully only just avoided. The disaster could have been far worse, if not for the 2 aforementioned individuals, the Marconi operators. At the turn of the 20th century, wireless technology was changing communication forever. Within moments, messages could be relayed across hundreds of miles to the sounds of electrical sparks and musical tones. The Marconi Room, a mysterious temple full of glittering machines of brass, vulcanite, glass and platinum, with straggling wires and rows of switches and fuse boxes, and a high priest, young, clean-shaven, alert and intelligent, sitting with a telephone cap over his head, sending out or receiving the whispers of the ether. Despite this, the apparatus was very much in its infancy and prone to malfunction. Nevertheless, for many young men, it was an appealing prospect. To adopt the role of an operator was to become a hybrid technician-seaman, half engineer, half adventurer. John Jack Phillips was born in 1887 and enrolled in the Marconi Training School in 1906. After a number of roles within the company, by 1912 he was considered one of the best in the business. Although aged only 25, he was one of the world's most experienced wireless operators. Howell Bride was the junior of the two, aged just 22, but demonstrated much promise. Significantly, both were not enlisted as crew members on behalf of the White Star Line, but employed directly by Marconi. Private messages were far more lucrative for a commercial enterprise, whilst official correspondence regarding weather warnings were not prioritised. In 1912, wireless was still an erratic novelty. Range was short, operators were inexperienced, and signals were hard to catch. There was a lot of relaying, a lot of repeats, and a lot of frivolous private traffic. Passengers were fascinated by the new miracle, couldn't resist the temptation of sending messages to friends back home or on other ships. As the Titanic carved its way through the ocean, all was well on board. Passengers enjoyed the many amenities available, whilst the crew acclimatised themselves to the new vessel. The two Marconi operators had been busy since leaving port. As a wireless proved popular with passengers, a deluge of telegrams were forwarded to family, friends and businesses. Phillips and Bride had indeed prioritised private correspondence, which the Marconi company charged by the letter, amounting to 12.5 shillings or $3 for every 10 words according to the book Titanic Lives. Some 250 messages had been sent by the midpoint of the journey. Then crisis struck. Not on Sunday, the 14th of April, the notorious evening upon which the Titanic struck the iceberg, but instead the previous day. This is no alternative history, but reality. It was sometime around 11 p.m. ship's time on Saturday the 13th of April, when Phillips was halfway into his 6-hour shift, that his wireless set began to act up. A breakdown rendered it unusable. Ignoring Marconi's instructions, Phillips and Bride tried to locate the fault, but it would be many hours before they found it. A quick side note before I continue, in order to preempt any comments I may have on the subject. A number of sources allege the malfunction in question occurred on the Friday evening. However, On a Sea of Glass provides detailed information and research which indicates the event took place on Saturday night, making their efforts on Sunday all the more remarkable. Whatever the case, after some time examining the apparatus, the fault was found. It turned out the leads from the secondary of the transformer had burned through the inside of the casing and made contact with some of the iron bolts which held the woodwork and frame together, thereby earthing the power to a great extent. I do not recall initially where I had come across the following, but Marconi and Company policy supposedly forbade operators to carry out repairs themselves whilst at sea, and instead register any issues with engineers once they were at port. I have seen this mentioned within secondary sources, but Marconi policy at the time is vague when it comes to specifics. A service bulletin provided to Marconi staff does touch upon expectations regarding repairs, but was published 4 years after the sinking, so take that for what it's worth. From time to time, the Maintenance, Repair and Installation Department advises operators to exercise better judgment in the operation of their instruments. We have devised a special station report, Form 47, which must be turned in to the MRI division immediately upon arrival, especially when repairs or replacements are needed. Operators have plenty of time to note the required repairs and replacements whilst at sea. Therefore, operators were tasked with filling out reports whenever an issue arose, so as to provide comprehensive information to the MRI department when the ship is in harbour. In any event, it is not out of the question to consider that Phillips and Bride could have interpreted the recommendations as gospel, and to err on the side of caution, avoid any intricate maintenance until the Titanic had docked in New York. This decision, however, would have likely caused ire amongst passengers keen to continue their correspondence. This was a main source of income for the two operators after all, and not an outcome they would have wanted to endure. On the other hand, it is unlikely that they would have felt undue pressure from their direct superiors on board the ship regarding the matter of instantaneous repairs. As far as Captain Smith was concerned, he had been commanding ships for decades without the use of wireless technology. Alternatively, the two could have simply failed in their efforts to repair the fault, and when disaster struck the liner, she would have been without any means of communication and the ability to call for distress, aside from signal rockets and Morse lamps. In such an eventuality, no ship would have received any CQD or SOS messages, and perhaps the only witnesses to Titanic's signals would have been those rockets which the Californian infamously misinterpreted. Those who had taken to the lifeboats, meanwhile, had only limited supplies and would in time eventually succumb to exposure. Potentially some of the survivors could have been discovered within the busy shipping lanes, or perhaps expert seamanship could have guided them to land, an endeavour alike Captain Bligh of the Bounty. But in all likelihood, as the weather inevitably turned for the worse, the occupants of the open-top boats would be extremely susceptible to the elements. This is all speculation, of course, and thankfully it is a possibility avoided thanks to the dedication of two men who for much of Saturday night and Sunday morning worked resolutely to repair the damage. Then, having spent much of Sunday catching up on the backlog of messages, both private and navigational, they gathered what energy remained to diligently carry out their duty during the sinking. It is remarkable to think that just two men were able to do all this, with only a short respite between shifts for much needed rest. Even after Captain Smith had personally released them from their duty as the power from the electrical generators faded, Phillips continued to press the oncoming RMS Carpathia with the urgency of their situation, whilst Bride recalled having to strap Phillips into his lifebelt as he worked at the Morse key. Phillips would ultimately lose his life in the disaster, whilst Bride would suffer from frostbitten feet and a sprained ankle, surviving on upturned collapsible B for hours until he was rescued. Despite his injuries, he would readily help Carpathia's wireless operator, Harold Cottam, in sending and receiving survivor messages during the onward journey to New York. The last words must go to Bride himself, however, who praised the courage of his co-worker. "He was a brave man. I learned to love him that night. I will never live to forget the work of Phillips for the last awful 15 minutes. Even aside of those 15 minutes, those two men had saved hundreds of lives which could have also been lost, their fate unknown, if not for their tireless efforts over the weekend of the 13th and 14th of April 1912.